the amendments to the revenue and financing policy. And if I can ask Andrew Duncan, Aaron Maddich and Ross Tucker, or any combination of those that are available.
Mr. Chairman, just before you start,
Councillor Cooper.
It's not a conflict, but I just want to note, in the recommendations it doesn't spell it out, but in number 8, bullet point 4, it talks about medium occupancy online accommodation providers. So that won't affect
that doesn't affect
hotels.
your role
okay.
in relation
Good.
to the trust that you're on, Councillor.
Great, thank you.
So no problem with that, but thank you for raising it. Right, gentlemen, would you like to speak to the paper?
Yeah, just briefly. As the Mayor has pointed out, this is a procedural report. The revenue and financing policy sets out how the Council funds its activities. There's a number of proposed changes for the LTP which need to be reflected in the revenue and financing policy. The revenue and financing policy has to be consulted on separately and adopted prior to the LTP, and once it's adopted, then it gets included in the LTP. So this is just essentially going through a consultation process to amend the revenue and financing policy to reflect the changes that you proposed in the LTP.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll move the recommendations accordingly. Councillor Clow, would you like to second that? And we'll first of all take any questions arising out of the paper. I think it's reasonably straightforward, but if you have any queries, please take the opportunity. If there are no questions, I'll open it up for any discussion. If there's no discussion, I'll put the recommendations. So it's been moved and seconded. Recommendation A and B. I'll put that to councillors. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. Thank you. We come now to item number 11, approval of the draft Council-controlled organisation accountability policy for consultation. And I'll ask Sarah Holdham and Alistair Cameron. You're on your lonesome, Sarah.
Yes, that's right. Thank you.
Welcome back to the committee. And if you'd just like to, I know you've addressed us in a different environment in the workshop, but if you'd just like to outline some of the key points.
Sure. Thank you, Mr Mayor. And good morning, councillors. So as...
I'll just move it formally before you start.
Sure.
My apologies for that. Councillor Simpson, you wanted to second that? So it's been moved and seconded. Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No problem, thank you. So as stated, the paper you have before you is seeking approval to consult on the revised council-controlled organisation accountability policy for the 10-year budget. And this policy is part of the long-term plan. This year we've taken the opportunity to revise and update the policy. I won't go over it at length, although I'm happy to answer questions on any part of it, as we did have a workshop on it a couple of weeks ago. Just briefly though, this policy is a foundational document. It's a baseline for accountability to the council as shareholder for the 6 substantive CCOs. It has 5 main components. The council's expectations of CCOs in relation to the council's objectives and priorities. Its expectations in relation to central government's priorities, and then the last 3 things are any additional reporting requirements, planning requirements, and policy provisions around the management of strategic assets. So perhaps I'll just touch on some of the comments and feedback that were raised at the workshop and how we've responded to those, and then I can answer questions. So briefly, the questions that you raised were, the first was around some concerns about how the provision around the public's expectation of accountability and transparency was. So this is on page 1 of the policy. So we've just amended that slightly just to note that CCOs must meet the public's expectation for accountability and transparency, and as well we've also noted that they should always consider the group's reputation in any activities they're undertaking or decisions they're making. The second piece of feedback that was raised was there's in the new section around common expectations, which is section 1.1. There was a point in the second section around providing value for money, which sets out all the sort of financial transparency and accountability expectations. There was a point raised that, as well as any significant changes that might impact on group debt, that just needed to be expanded to account for not just debt, but any significant changes to revenue. So we have done that, and that is on page 2. And then one point that was kind of echoed around the table was around also under the common expectations section on 1.1.7, which is around understanding Auckland's shared governance model, that only covered local boards and didn't really reflect the relationship between the substantive CCOs and individual members of the governing body. So we have redrafted that section to reflect both the governing body and the local boards. And particularly to note that CCOs should actively engage with councillors, relevant ward councillors, on projects and issues that are of likely to be significance within their ward area. So hopefully that addresses some of the concerns that were raised. And then lastly, I believe it was, so this is related to that previous point, Councillor Hulse, you raised a concern around that while we need to ensure that CCOs are listening to the views of local boards and through them local communities and responding to them, that while they're doing that, it doesn't undermine the achievement of regional strategies and priorities. So that's, I think, a really important and sort of quite a foundational and key concept. So we've also added a line just underneath that section to reflect that point. And obviously that's something that needs to be sort of enforced, but that needs to be kind of actively monitored and working with the CCOs to ensure that's given effect to. So those are I think those were largely the points of feedback in relation to the policy. So we've made a few other changes for purpose of clarity. And I'll just note briefly about the process. So obviously we will consider any submissions. If the policy is approved today, we will, once the consultation's completed, we'll consider any submissions, but also we are working with our counterparts at each of the CCOs to further refine the policy, and several of them are intending to put the policy to their boards. So we'll also take on board any feedback that the CCO boards might have for us. But just to note that none of them have raised any significant concerns with the policy so far. So that's really largely the sort of all I'll say at the moment, but obviously happy to answer any questions about the policy.
Very much, Sarah. So first of all, we'll take any questions. I think we've probably run through those in the workshop, but Councillor Darby, you've got something further to that.
Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, thanks for the email on a question that you responded to yesterday. Just on, and that was relating, something I raised earlier was clarifying the definition of waterfront land, and I did refer to the floating valuable assets, which are not land, that are piled, etc. So can you just clarify how that has been captured as a strategic asset?
So, yes, thank you, Councillor Darby. So the strategic assets are not actually defined in this policy. They're defined in the significance and engagements policy. So they're restated in this policy, but their sort of home is in the significance policy. So at the moment, how it's defined, Panuku's only strategic asset is on page 17 of the policy. It's currently defined as the freehold interests in waterfront land. So you raised that point about non-land structures, the WARs. And I think there is a need for a little bit more preciseness in the way that is defined, but we haven't had the opportunity or the time to do that in this consultation version. So I think what we're going to do is to work with Panuku to define it sort of in an exclusive way rather than an inclusive way. So we will, we just need to work with them and with our legal team to ensure that it's kind of correctly expressed. Sorry, does that answer your question?
It does. So it needs to be, just for clarification, it needs to be picked up as a change in the significance and engagement policy first, and
That's
then
right.
it gets
And then
translated
reflected
into this at a later time when we review this again, possibly.
That's right. So, well, I think just to clarify, so the significance and engagement policy, as you know, isn't being reviewed fundamentally this year. So whether that's so any major changes to that policy also have to be consulted on, but it's a question of whether that sort of clarification of the definition is actually a major change. So I need to work with my legal colleagues, but there is a possibility that it can be done in time to for the decisions on this long-term plan.
Okay.
But otherwise it will be picked up in the future.
It would seem that if you acquire an asset that becomes you identify it as a strategic asset, the policy should just allow a very quick amendment. I mean, that's what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with a major change to the policy.
Yes.
But look, I take that point. Just in terms of the naming of strategic assets, in the significance and engagement policy, the stadium at North Harbour is not referred to by the sponsor's name, and it's referred to by our name of it, and sponsors' names can change as we... Why are you suggesting it be called in this document QBE Stadium when it actually has a council name? I'm just a little bit concerned about, it's not our job to promote that sponsor's name, be it Spark Arena or QBE, and the list goes on. It could be the Ericsson Stadium again, etc. So what's our pattern here?
I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think we just thought that that is kind of what it is more commonly known as, so we would reflect it as that. But it doesn't, you know, I think it doesn't necessarily need to be that. We could go back to the kind of common council name for it. Yeah, I mean, if that's something that you wish to change.
Well, York City Arena is the official name for the one in the downtown. I'll leave that. And just lastly, Mr Mayor, the sections as they relate to the various CCOs, have they been updated? I can see a lot of the language in there reflecting our most recent letters of expectation. Have those sections been updated to reflect those?
So you mean the sections from 1.2 onwards for each CCO?
Yeah.
So we drafted them sort of roughly concurrently, so they should have kind of common concepts and language. But I guess the idea is that this policy is slightly more enduring, and the letters of expectation they do kind of, while they sort of have common themes from year to year, they do tend to change a wee bit more according to the priorities of the council. So I think they're broadly consistent, but...
So, okay, so you've picked up those LOEs broadly.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mr Mayor, there was a supplementary LOE that you sent out, which I thought was really important, and that was to all the CCOs on a very fundamental issue to address climate change and all their strategic planning.
Okay.
And I think that, and for AT to acknowledge the fossil-free street direction that we're taking, but probably particularly for all CCOs, and maybe this just needs to be delegated to the Mayor and Deputy Mayor to just sign off the refinements. Is there possibility with that? I think that's pretty fundamental.
Okay.
I considered that as I was reading the papers, Councillor, and we have under the AT policy, under B, it includes a bullet point minimising harm from the transport system on people and the environment, but it could be more explicit than that. But this is a document that goes out for consultation, so after we see what we get back from consultation, there could well be amendments to this policy anyway, and we can fine-tune it.
Well, look, I would prefer that we lead the amendments here for public consultation. That is a fundamental direction of this council as outlined in the supplementary LOE. It is a big issue. We just discussed it yesterday. I would like to have scope for the officers to amend it now and send it out for consultation, not wait. That is just too fundamental.
Yep. So because that letter you're referring to went out to all CCOs, the question is whether we would do that under common expectations rather than simply CCO by CCO. So perhaps, Sarah, if you could have a look at the supplementary letter that went out to SOEs and make an appropriate amendment to draw the attention to taking account of
Yes.
climate change and the impact on that would be helpful.
Yes.
I'm just looking at the sections to see if there's an easy way of changing it under one of the headings. I don't know whether it's under management of risk, but perhaps you could come back to me and to Councillor Darby on that point.
I'm happy to do
Councillor
that.
Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I've got a question on 1.1.7, so I'll just give you a minute to bring it up. And thank you very much for, listening to our concerns and putting them in. But it's around the third bullet point. We're actively engaged with the relevant ward councillors on projects and issues within their ward that are likely to be of interest. My question to you is, are you saying that it's the CCO's responsibility to decide what projects and issues will be of interest to the ward councillor, or are you asking for the ward councillor to make that decision? It's not clear in that bullet point.
I think I would answer that question by saying that I think we would expect the CCOs to have, kind of a broad indication of, or to apply their judgment, I guess, when thinking about whether something might be of interest. But obviously where there is uncertainty, they need to put in a sort of a process in place to kind of gauge that kind of thing.
So my suggestion, and I know this is not feedback, it's going out for consultation. My suggestion is that we just take that are likely to be of interest out, because if the ward councillor is copied into everything that the local board has, everything that happens in their area, then there's no conflict. Or do you talk about it? I don't think, for me, there's a bit of a risk around whether the CCO decides.
Who makes the judgment?
Yeah, makes the judgment call. And I think as shared governance, noting that the CCOs are responsible to the governing body, it should be us. So let us make the call, and if you take out those words that are likely to be of interest, it just, I think it makes it clearer. And Your Worship, I'm coming to you then. I ask the question, do you amend it here or do you leave it later? I'm ambivalent, but the point I'm making is I don't think that is the right statement and necessarily clear in its intent.
I certainly understand the point. I guess that, I was thinking about whether it was on significant projects or issues, or whether that allows an out too. Probably you don't want every pothole to be raised with it. So I think taking out those words, the question is whether you want to just leave it as it stands with those last 7 words excluded, or whether you want to talk on significant projects and issues. Just leave it as it stands?
Regional.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be happy to take those 7 words out.
Okay.
And then the ward council, I think it's up to them to talk to the CCO themselves, because what is important to me might not be important to my colleagues.
That's fine. Councillor Hills, that's your point too, is it?
Yes, and just Desley and I have been working on this because I actually get a very good service, both Chris and I get, because our relationship manager from AT sends us everything. So might be the big projects and Chris and I might feed in, and we also get the yellow lines, but we just tell them that we don't want it. But it's just so good to know, because if we get the call, just like the local board member gets the call, and often...
I think point's well made, so if we just take out those last 7 words...
not happening for every councillor, so it needs to be happening for everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Holz.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think it's fantastic that we are going out to consult on this. I've just got a question about so we go out and talk to people, and we might get 9 people talk to us about the accountability of CCOs. As part of the process for taking this out for consultation, and we may have discussed this, and I apologise if we have, in our consultation process and in our information material that we send out, are we pointing people to this? Because a lot of the, a lot of the focus is on the rates and the budget and the Auckland plan. But to many Aucklanders, and having just come from a meeting of the Te Atatu Peninsula Business Association, they're really interested in the relationship that we have with our CCOs. So my question is, I'm just interested in, maybe that's a wider discussion when we come to the collateral and consultation discussion.
Thank you, through the Chair. So my understanding is that it's part of the supporting information document, and I don't think there are any specific pointers to that policy, but Ross is probably better qualified to answer.
Sorry, do you want to add to that?
Yes, just to clarify. So on in the consultation document that will be before you to adopt later today, there is a reference on page 32 of the consultation document calling out the CCO accountability policy and directing people to that supporting information, which they can access online or through libraries. So
maybe I'll pick it up when we discuss the document, because I think a reference, and it is just a reference. But I'll tell you why I asked Mr Mayor is I'm interested, and this will be no surprise to you, in 1.1.2, the value for money part that we've put into here, which I think is reasonable. I think the wording is clumsy, but we'll see what feedback we get. But contained within 1.1.2 is the essence of a much wider debate and discussion about why we do what we do, our accountability with our CCOs, and how we work with them, because the heart of what this provide value for money paragraph is trying to achieve is to drive down costs, I presume, and quite rightly, and you've been clear on this, to make sure that we can look every Auckland ratepayer in the eye and say, we are giving you value for money, for the money that we take out of your pockets and spend for you in Auckland. However, in here, we kind of miss the point of value to Aucklanders rather than just value for money. So I guess my question is, if we are to direct people to the CCO accountability framework, we should be directing people very clearly into the question of what actually is value for money and how do we set the parameters for what value means. So I think that's probably a little point to pick up in our collateral and in our supporting document information.
Thank you. I'm glad it is in the consultation document to refer to it, because I think this is not an esoteric issue. No. It's an issue where a lot of people raise with us how accountable are the CCOs, and I think that will come up quite frequently in our meetings. Just on value for money, it's actually driving down costs is probably not the best description. What we're trying to do is to get the best value from every dollar we invest. This is not about cutting our expenditure. It's about ensuring that the expenditure that we have got is getting the best return in terms of product and services we can for the electorate. So it's not simply razor gang. It is saying if we're not spending a dollar here wisely, that dollar is not available to spend over here. And I think it's probably important to differentiate those two definitions, because if it is just seen as cutting cost accounting, cost of everything, value of nothing, it's not what we're after. But I think we should have that discussion.
Yeah, I think, Mr Mayor, I guess I'm agreeing 100%. I think we need to kind of amplify the fact that this is in here because it's a critical discussion. What we actually want, and use an example, is the value for money we would get from Watercares for them to spend more money on actually dealing with broken pipes. So we might say value for money, value for Aucklanders is Watercares effectively spending much more money, and I think we need to be having that discussion.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. And this document is important because the 10-year plan and what we have in it is binding on the CCOs. It is arguably at least as important, if not more important, than the statement of intent. Okay, Councillor Casey.
Yes, sir, it's a much better document as a result of all the changes. I especially like the changes to the trust and confidence section, and the questions I have relate to the section 1.1.7, which you've rewritten entirely, which is great. When you're talking to the boards of CCOs, I'd like to know how they're going to carry out that role of actively engaging. That's an issue for me. I don't. We all, I think it came up at the workshop, we all access the CCOs at different levels and in different ways. And I think it's time for that to be structured in some way. So I would be very interested, especially Auckland Transport and Water Care, and how they're going to physically do that and not leave it just as a kind of thing up there.
Can I just clarify, are you talking about ward councillors specific? Yes. Yeah. So I should just refer back to, as you know, through the governance framework review, one of the actions was to engage with ward councillors on transport issues, and that was raised obviously in relation to you raising it. So I think you'll shortly be getting a paper on implementation of that Auckland Transport's commitments from that review, and one of those is about how they're going to implement that. So you should get more detail about that, at least from Auckland Transport. But I certainly take on board the feedback around the other CCOs. I think that is something we do need to work on and to perhaps put a bit more structure in place. So I think that's
to
useful.
add to that, the other thing that came up at the workshop is a lot of the time we are forwarding complaints on behalf of constituents, and again we all do it differently. And there's no fast track. Not that they should be fast track, but sometimes they should.
Yeah.
My other question was your use of the word genuinely in the sentence, consult with local boards genuinely and early in a way that allows them to influence decisions. What do you mean by genuinely?
Genuinely in the sense that it is they are genuinely seeking, going to the board with a problem or an issue and some options, and genuinely seeking their feedback rather than a predetermined solution and kind of, doing it as a tick box exercise.
Excellent word to use.
Yeah, thank you. And just to clarify that, depending on the sort of the scope of what they're talking about or the nature of what they're talking about, sometimes that consultation is, so for example, if it's a safety issue, there are some things that and these are legislative obligations that they have to obviously give effect to, and so the kind of feedback might need to be, that they're seeking from the board, might need to be structured in a way that kind of safeguards their ability to do what they have to do. So they can't do anything that's unsafe or,
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Linda Cooper.
Thank you. I just want two things. Just want to support Councillor Darby. I think in table 4.1 in the RFA assets that are managed on behalf of council, there needs to be consistency. You've got QBE, formerly known as North Harbour, Auckland City Arena, known as Spark. I'd suggest that you put the name that we're known as, like Mount Smart, and just put known as Spark, known as QBE, because it's not consistent, and because those sponsors can change every few years. So I think if you've got the basic name, so there's that one. The other one is a question around water care, because we know that is under a slightly different it's a structural entity, which we had the chance to change around 14-15, and we didn't do that. Does council under that structure have as much, I suppose, ability to have expectations and control as other CCOs? And is it something, Mr Mayor, you've looked at in the last year? You may not have had a chance, you've got so many other things to look at, but is it a possibility to look at bringing it into similar structure as the other CCOs? Sort of a question for both of you, I guess. First one about the control
Sarah,
issues.
So it still is a council-controlled organisation, and they're still required to do all of the sort of statement of intent and be accountable to the shareholder. Obviously, they do set, as you said, water charges and their infrastructure growth charges, and so they don't receive any direct funding from. So I guess, I think that does kind of lend itself to perhaps a slightly different relationship in terms of, what they're doing, but I think, I'm not sure if I'm answering your
So
question.
our ability
but-
to have the expectations that we want it's still as full as the other CCOs is what I'm
yes,
trying to get
they
at. I just
still-
didn't, want to know if there's any difference in that regard in terms of our monitoring and expectation.
There's still a CCO under the Local Government Act, which means they have to, fulfil the shareholders' intent,
Okay.
which is
Thank you.
correct.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. My question is, and thanks, others have asked questions around 1.1.7, which I like. I just wanted to ask a question around definition, and I know you might not put in like a glossary, but when this goes out for consultation, and I'm referring on page 10 of the report to it's the Panuku part, 1.5.5 maybe. The final bullet point in that first paragraph says optimise returns from the disposal and development of land. And I'm not sure if this question belongs here, but I'm trying to work out if I'm approaching this, if this is out for consultation, what the word optimise might mean, and what others, we've had the word maximise as well. So what the public is thinking when they come across these terms, granted the fact that there will be people, say, in the Manukau region who are thinking about Transform Manukau and our own holdings that might be disposed of, and whether some of that money might be returned to a project like that. So I'm not trying to get into the actual consultation of it, but just so that people have a fair idea whether they should be stating things like that explicitly, or whether they can have an inherent kind of understanding that optimise means the return on that is going to, say, a Transform Manukau project.
I think, so I would say that optimise has been used, I think, rather than maximise, because it's not, so it is about kind of, does it say in a commercially robust way, so we kind of want them to sort of act, quite kind of within house, I guess, but it's not just about sort of flicking assets off for as much as you can get them, because it does refer to development as well. So we obviously, as a council, are quite clear that we want them to achieve other outcomes from those developments. It's not just about kind of maximising financial return.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, sort of defined to a greater or lesser degree on certain things. But there are also discussions ongoing, as I understand it, about whether there should be some reinvestment of. So I won't get into that here because it's not.
Yeah, I think it's a point well made, Councillor. The return in the case of the development you're thinking about, it might be a social return as well as a financial return. And I think we've played around with those words before, so that it's not simply, if we're just selling a piece of land that's not for a social purpose, then of course you'd want to get the best return financially. But if there is a social purpose and it's about affordable housing, then that would have to come into the requirement on Panuku. And I think you're right to raise it because it is an issue, but they have acknowledged that, and I think in the settlement of that case in exactly the way that you would want and expect.
Great, thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Just draw Councillor's attention to and seek approval from my seconder. We should have as C in our recommendations the normal clause about minor editorial changes. So are you happy to incorporate that, Councillor Simpson?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Now, is there any further comment on this particular paper and recommendations? We've kind of run questions and comments a little together. That's fine. If not, I will put recommendations A to C as appear on the screen in front of you. All of those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I declare it carried. Right, we now come to the third and